Aloha, my name is Dr. Mellisa Yee from Seeds of Truth. My guest today is Dr. Jonathan Latham from Ithaca, New York, and I'm having him to speak a little bit more about what he has observed here in Hawaii, and specifically the GMO papaya, which has been under a lot of scrutiny for the last 20 years or so. And I think we'll start talking about that. So, Dr. Latham, thank you for being here.
Hi, Mellisa. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes, you know, there has been so much controversy about the ringspot virus. And I know a few years ago it came out that there was actually a protein in the papaya which could actually be contributing to immune system problems. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because I'm not quite familiar with the science.
Yeah, for sure. So, you know, not only the GMO papaya, right? So many GMOs have a sequence in them called the cauliflower mosaic virus 35S promoter. And this is a piece of DNA that's not supposed to encode any protein. And so it's been approved on the basis of its name, essentially. And we discovered that about 3 years ago, that the European Union, the Food Safety Authority, they'd basically been running some tests on all GMOs to look for what are called open reading frames. So an open reading frame is basically a piece of DNA that is capable of producing a protein. And they discovered that there was one of these open reading frames ran right across the cauliflower mosaic virus 35S promoter. And they published a paper basically attempting to bury this finding, right? Because this affects, you know, a huge proportion, more than half of all GMOs.
Yes.
That they're producing this protein which originates in a pathogenic virus. And so they attempted to basically publish this data, but also at the same time bury it, right? So this allows them to say, well, we've recognized this problem, but also that we've dealt with it, right? So this kind of buries it for them. But I happened to notice this publication, and I recognized immediately what protein they were talking about, because I had actually researched it a little bit in the past, but I couldn't get the data on the actual sequences that companies were using. So I just kind of left it. But when this came up, that they had found the exact thing that I had surmised probably existed, then I understood what the gene was that was encoded by this, but the protein that was encoded by this gene. And it is a protein that interferes with the plant immune system. It also causes basically more than one protein to be produced from each RNA molecule. So in all of normal biology, one RNA molecule usually produces one protein. There are some issues about splicing and so on and so forth. But what this protein does, that's produced in these cauliflower mosaic virus promoters, is it stops what's called a ribosome from falling off when it's made a protein. And it causes it to stay on the RNA and make another protein after that. And then, if that's available, another one after that. So it basically, this is how the virus is using this protein to do a kind of weird virus type of expression that's very efficient from the virus's point of view, because the virus is very small. They have to pack in a lot of information. So this is why it has a gene overlapping a promoter. Right? This is the nature of viruses, that they have every piece of DNA is multifunctional, and this is what was happening with this viral promoter. So you've got a viral promoter that is encoding. It didn't encode the whole gene, but it encoded a large proportion of it. And this gene is known to have all these properties, right? It has and other ones too. And so this is a protein that you would never put into a GMO plant. If somebody applied formally to put that in, a regulator would just turn them down flat and say, you must be mad. And so, but this is what was there at this point discovered inadvertently to be expressed in all these GMOs.
So it was actually fortunate. Yeah, it was actually fortunate that they did discover that, and that they were willing to print it, publish it, But like
there's
you
a
said,
certain amount of credit that goes with that. Yeah, I mean the EPA, the US EPA did not do that experiment.
Right.
Yeah.
So the European Food Safety Commission went ahead and produced that paper and then tried to cover it up. And all these years, the last 3 years, we continue to eat the GMO papaya in Hawaii and export it to the world. Fortunately, many countries are refusing to import it, but the people who live here are eating it on a daily basis.
Yep.
So,
and it's no doubt being spread by pollen and so forth unknowingly.
Right. Yes.
In many cases.
Yeah, of course. Well, you just take the seeds and drop them in your backyard, and now you've got several plants growing. Yeah. And unless you go for testing at the University of Hawaii, you have no way of knowing whether or not it is GMO.
Yeah.
So what do you think the consequences are for the health of the people who are eating it?
We don't know for sure. What we do know is that, so we don't know, this is an open reading frame, is what it's called, right? It's a potential to produce this protein.
Yes.
And there are several other things that also have to happen. Yeah. But the issue with those other things is they happen pretty often, right? So this is not a remote potential possibility. It's a likely one. It will be different in each GMO because it depends on the context, the genetic context of that sequence. But what the European Union did was they had a look to see whether, they just looked at one GMO, it wasn't the papaya, to see whether there was RNA that ran over that sequence that could actually be, as part of the step of producing the protein itself. And indeed they found that the RNA was indeed being produced in the right direction, in the right form, and so on and so forth. Right? So that creates even more strongly the probability that this protein is actually being produced in these plants. And they dropped it, right? Then they didn't want to go any further because oh dear, this is becoming a little hot for us. So essentially nobody's doing any research on it at this point. But one of the issues about this protein, for example, is that humans have the same form of humans have different kinds of immune systems, and so do plants. But this form of the immune system is shared between plants and animals. And so this protein may well interfere with the human immune system. Yeah. Right? If we ingest that protein and take it up in our guts, and most things that we eat, to some level, end up in our bloodstream. Yeah. This is one of the mythologies of biology, right? That everything you eat is broken down utterly in the gut, right? When carrots pass through you or whatever, that's because it is not being broken down in the gut, right? And so everything that you eat, to some extent, is broken down, and to some extent is taken up whole. You have to get whole amino acids from your diet, for example. So things are not being broken down utterly.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem, that our guts have become so toxic because the preservatives and the chemicals and the food additives, the colorings that are put into the food to make it more palatable. And so this mix is coming through the stomach as well as the small and large intestine, and are having to be broken down. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But because, for example, this protein that's mixing with the gut bacteria that we already have, it's probably compromising its effectivity.
It's perfectly possible. Yeah. And what we do know is that there are examples of GMO crops that appear to have harm, that do cause harm to animals, right? And so the question then becomes, is it due to this protein, or is it due to some other feature of these GMOs or whatever? There's all these questions that I don't think we need definitive answers to these things.
But then who would take on another study? If the possibility...
Well, that's a great question. It's like, if no one wants to do it, it comes down to the question of who will fund it.
Yes.
Right? A scientist will do it. If somebody says, here's a $5 million check, there's a ton of scientists that would do that experiment, but nobody's waving those checks.
Yeah. Because the interest has been to maintain the image that GMO has done so much. And because it's so much a part of our diet here in America, people, although they believe they're eating organic or they're eating non-GMO, they really don't know, because the cooking oils, the syrups, the all the ingredients which are GMO are affecting our bodies. And then also the spraying of the Roundup. Can you elaborate a little bit more about Roundup spraying?
Roundup is being used more and more.
Yes.
This is a huge issue. There is peer-reviewed data. There is even EPA toxicological data that Roundup is not good for you. And so, with the era of GMO, right, that spraying has become more and more intense. And so you have a whole sort of collection of circumstances that are causing Roundup to be more and more part of the diet. So you have the fact that farmers are spraying it on late in the season to dry off their crops, right? You're having the fact that if a crop is it's one thing I talk about, is how if you make a crop resistant to a herbicide, that means that farmers can spray on the herbicide, not just at the beginning of the season when they used to, but also in the middle of the season or even just before they harvest it.
Yes.
Right? So you have, in the case of non-GMO crops, like wheat, you have Roundup being sprayed just before harvest, but it's basically to kill the crop. Right? So it's not related to the GMO-ness. It wouldn't even work if it was a GMO.
Right.
But in the case of GMOs, what that means is farmers are spraying herbicides onto these crops, and this is just before you eat them, right? So what previously had to be done in March now can be done in July or August, just before you eat the thing. So this leads to a huge increase in exposure of the population. And so the organizations like the EPA and the European Food Safety Authority have been allowing larger and larger amounts of Roundup and other herbicides into the food supply by default, by basically regulating them less and less stringently.
Yeah. So although wheat is not a GMO crop, because of the presence of the Roundup in the grain, we are being exposed to the detrimental effects of it.
Yeah, and it gets into the beer and it gets into the bread.
It's everywhere. And the whole idea that you can eat gluten-free and avoid having your various allergies and reactions is also a ruse.
Yes, I don't know too much about gluten and gluten-free eating, and I don't suffer from that issue. But, there is interesting questions, right? Where these modern illnesses are coming from.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we're doing things differently. People are becoming sick in all kinds of ways that they didn't used to become sick. And it's probably chemicals in the diet. These are gut problems, right? So the obvious thing is it's in your food.
Yes.
Right? So that's the front line. Your body's front line is your gut in many cases. When people have, experience chemical toxicity, they often experience it on their skin, right? But if you eat those chemicals or different chemicals that your gut is sensitive to, the same kind of manifestations are likely to occur. So, and we are increasingly exposing ourselves to a huge cocktail of different kinds of chemicals, hundreds and hundreds. If you eat processed food, which I, steer away from as much as I can, then you're exposing yourself to huge numbers of things, many of which are demonstrated as toxins.
Yeah. And you had mentioned in one of your articles that by focusing on banning one chemical, such as Roundup or dioxin or DDT, that you're avoiding the bigger picture, which is that the chemicals in themselves are harmful to you. So you're replacing one chemical with another, but you're still going to have the harmful effects, maybe in a different way, but you're still being poisoned.
Yeah. I mean, there are environmental campaigns of banning one chemical at a time that are not addressing the fundamental issue.
Yeah.
Right? The fundamental issue is generalized toxins in the environment that are inadequately or even not at all tested. So that is the question. And like you suggested, if even if you succeed in banning a single chemical, if all that happens is replaced by another one, then this is it's not clear what the benefit is at that point, because we are on a sequence of events in which to kill insects we used to use arsenic, and then we changed to DDT,
right.
And then after we changed to DDT, we used other kind of chlorinated compounds, And then when we decide that they're no good anymore, then we move to organophosphates.
Mm-hmm.
Then we realize that those are killing the farmers. So then we move on to neonicotinoids, and we realize they're killing all the pollinators and so on and so forth. This is not progress.
Yeah, it's endless though,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah. So, but we're making the wrong requests.
Yes,
here,
that's right.
right? Is my point.
Yeah, so how would we go about demanding the banning of all chemicals?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because we're looking now the results of so many years of plastics in our environment. They've
Yeah.
been extremely handy for us to be using in food production, but at the same time now we've got these garbage patches appearing in all the different oceans, especially the Pacific Ocean, and the chemical companies are offering to clean them up. Which is quite comical, I think, because they're the ones who actually produce these chemicals that led to becoming plastics.
Yeah.
So how do we go about creating a movement that will actually ban all chemicals? Does it have to start with the individual, that the person becomes so strict that he or she must avoid anything that is not natural?
Yeah. I mean, you can protect yourself to a significant degree, but you cannot do everything, right? You know, the cases of spray drift on Hawaii, right, are good demonstrations of that. You know, you can probably reduce your exposure to chemicals by somewhere between 90 and 99%. But at the same time, that will cost you money, right? Not everyone can afford to do that.
Right.
And also time, right? You have to devote yourself to finding alternative sourcing and driving further maybe to buy these things. You also, so essentially it's it is an answer, but it doesn't protect the environment, right? If you up to a point it does, right? If you're buying food without packaging, you are protecting the environment, right? There's one of the things I like to explain to people is how the food system and agriculture are the nexus of our environmental and social crises. That individual choices make a huge difference inside that system. By choosing simply local, organic food, you avoid vast amounts of packaging, vast amounts of chemical use, vast amounts of slave labor. You benefit. You're benefiting the rainforest. You're benefiting coral reefs. You are really doing a tremendous amount for the environment. But at the same time, you cannot change the world, right? Unless everybody can be convinced to do these things, then we need government or some kind of more overarching and broad-ranging intervention to move that process along. And I don't particularly see that happening. I don't see any enthusiasm on their part.
No.
And because, what they're seeing is their economy going down the tubes. There's a nexus also for the economy, right? And not only, those local parts like agribusiness and the tractor companies and the fertilizer industry, but also the health industry, right? If we all started eating healthy food, we wouldn't be spending 20% of our income on health insurance because we will be living longer.
Yeah.
And essentially what happens when you live longer, you live healthily and you live longer. What happens is you die of old age, right? Old age is not treatable, right? You live until a good age and then you decline in an inevitable way. And, people worry about, if I got rid of all these things from my environment and made myself healthy, then I would be sick longer. But that's not what I see happening. What I see happening is these people living, long drawn-out illnesses on medications and so on and so forth that are basically miserable existences, but also are ending early at the same time. But we can avoid all these things, but it causes a crisis for the economy unless you transition us to moving to, outdoor living and healthy growing and so on and so forth. We need a somewhat different economy in many, many ways. But, if people, basically people imagine they don't want to work outside and on farms and growing food and, some of them doing more traditional activities, But you find that actually this is the dream of many people. When they retire, what do? They go to the country and they start growing vegetables, right? This is how people are in England.
Yeah.
But the chemical company has convinced the politicians that people don't want that. They don't want to live in a nice, beautiful surroundings with palm trees or growing fruit trees and whatever, which is what could happen, right?
Yeah.
That's how things could happen. But we do live in a society in which organizations and the government organize the transition away from that system, right? Obviously the 200 years ago when many people lived on the land, when many people looked after themselves, things were not perfect. But at the same time, the government attempted to move people into the cities. They did it as a deliberate ploy,
right. That was an
to
agenda
generate the economy. It was an
Yes.
agenda
Yeah.
of the chemical industry, of the oil industry, of the Rockefeller Foundation to do the green revolution and so on and so forth. Because people who eat and grow their own food are not contributing to the economy.
That's right.
They're helping themselves, and they're not destroying the planet.
Yeah.
But at the same time, and they're not creating climate change, for example, but they're not helping the economy. And the government, the bottom line for the government is they need an economy in order to tax, to run an army, to consolidate their own power.
Let's talk a little bit about the poison papers that you came upon several years ago. That reveals the complicity between the EPA and the chemical companies. Can you talk a little bit about how you came over these papers and what in general they reveal?
Yeah, I first came across them when there was a lady writing for our website. She'd already written one article for us, and then she wanted to write another one. So her name is Carol Van Strum. She wanted to write for us, and she had some allegations about the EPA and its collusion with the chemical industry. And what she wanted to argue was quite inflammatory. And I said to her, you have to support this. We can't just write it on our website. People have to be able to trace this information back to actual words of the agency and so forth. So, and she didn't want to go there. She's not technically savvy. All the stuff is in paper in her barn or whatever. She didn't even necessarily know where the piece of paper was and so on.
Where does she live?
She lives in Oregon. She lives in the woods of Oregon. So I made some calls and found out that she had been using Freedom of Information Act requests. She'd been working with lawyers. She'd been an environmental activist for 40 years. And she had been collecting all this information, incriminating information about the companies, about the EPA, about different government agencies. And she was sitting on all this stuff. And what the people I spoke to said, if she's claiming this, likely it's true. And so I thought, well, we should find some way in the modern era of collecting all this information together, making it available so that it's digitized and online and so on and so forth. So that's what the Poison Papers Project is. It's taking her documents and those are one or two others that she was associated with. And these are documents that cover PCBs, toxins, pesticides, and all these different agencies. And a lot of it was originally the thing that set her off was that she lived in Oregon. She was sprayed with Agent Orange by the Forest Service that was basically coming through with helicopters and planes and spraying the woods with Agent Orange. It was basically the companies wanted a market for Agent Orange. After they left Vietnam, they still wanted to make Agent Orange.
So this was after Vietnam?
Yeah, shortly after Vietnam. Yeah, very shortly after.
So they continued to use it even though there was so much controversy around it, which continues to this day.
Yeah, they just moved to spraying American forests. Yeah.
So that was under the guise of controlling weeds or?
Yeah, I suppose the nominal reason was to controlling weeds. Yeah.
Yeah. So now those papers are online, and what kind of response have you had to it?
We've had some decent media coverage. So it's been in The Guardian, it's been in The Intercept, it's been in BuzzFeed, it's been in a reasonable amount of media. I was interviewed by the Jesse Ventura show on RT.
Yes.
The various shows like that, but to me, not anywhere near the amount of media coverage that these papers actually deserve.
Yes, of course not.
They demonstrate collusion between the EPA, extending for decades, thousands of chemicals, thousands of chemical tests are fraudulent, badly done, EPA accepting documents from these testing companies that are unsigned. Just a massive exposure of the agency. You know, the take-home conclusion of these papers for me is that EPA does not believe that they can actually go to the wall with these companies, right? They cannot take these companies and make them accountable in Washington, because they basically have to go. They have to get the approval of the president to basically fine Monsanto what would actually be appropriate. They have to ban their products and so on and so forth and do these actions that would be appropriate. They don't have the political backing. They never did have, and they still do not.
Yeah.
And so what EPA officials realize is that the only solution to this is, when they come across this evidence of chemical harm, is to bury it. And you see everybody in the agency basically burying information. Instead of passing on to their boss, they bury it.
Yeah.
Right? And the little bit they feel they have to pass on to their boss, that boss buries. So you see this kind of iterative process by which all evidence of chemical harm from all these pesticides and so on and so forth is just sort of massaged away by the EPA bureaucracy.
Yeah. So people can actually go to that website, the Poison Papers Project, and read all those documents themselves.
Yeah. So there are a lot. There's 20,000 documents, 2.5 tons of paper. So that's not a trivial. That's a PhD thesis right there. but that information is in there, and we're steadily writing articles and encouraging journalists to come and pay attention to these papers so they can write about them themselves and see the evidence for themselves.
So I would want to ask you, as we close, what do you do to keep yourself healthy and to keep those around you aware that there's more to be done?
Yeah. I mean, these are two pretty different things. To keep myself healthy, I eat as much as I can organic, non-GMO food. We have in our house, we try to have as few things as possible that are made of plastic. So, most things in our house are made of metal, glass, or wood, for example. And we try to avoid, paints and, all kinds of things like that, the off-gas chemicals and so on, because I know that none of this stuff is tested, right? It's so obvious to me as a biologist. And so, even if these agencies were willing to do it, they don't have the money, right? We have never given them the money to do all that. But I knew before these papers, the necessary science is already there to know that these things are not tested for all these different biological processes that can go wrong that would cause major problems to you. Gut problems and learning difficulties. These things are not tested for. Right. So if your children have gut problems and learning difficulties, then there's a good reason to wonder whether it's chemicals.
Yeah, we have a lot of that in Hawaii.
Yeah, everywhere.
So I thank you again for coming here, for sharing with us, and people can go to your websites and learn more about the things that you are so excited about and continue to do. So thank you very much, Dr.
Well, thank you
Latham.
for the interview.